Alright guys, in this series we're talking about state gun laws and we're going alphabetically, state by state, talking about each one. And here's state number 2 in the alphabets. It's Seward's Icebox, the Frozen North, the Last Frontier, Alaska. I've broken the analysis down into 9 categories. You can check the description for timestamps if you want to skip around to them, but I'm going to try to keep it brief enough to where it's easy to just sit through the whole thing. At the end, I'll be giving the state a grade. If you like this sort of content, do me a favor and like the video and subscribe. It helps me know what kind of content to focus on, and it's a nice thing to do, and I appreciate it.
While the host of Fuddbusters is a lawyer, he is not your lawyer. If you pay him, maybe, either way you slice it, the video that you are about to watch is not to be construed as legal advice.
So first, let's take a look at Alaska's constitution and whether it has a provision protecting the right to keep and bear arms. Keep this provision in mind as we go through the rest of the sections so that we can get a feel for how much respect the state has for the rule of its own law. Article 1, Section 19 of the Alaska Constitution provides as follows. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The individual right to keep and bear arms shall not be denied or infringed by the state or a political subdivision of the state. That sounds pretty decent, right? Well, remember, a constitutional proviso is only as strong as the highest court interpreting it, and it appears Alaska's Supreme Court is a bit weak in the knees on Section 19. For example, in 1997, the Alaska Court of Appeals upheld a law that banned people from possessing firearms when under the influence of intoxicating liquors. In the case of Gibson v. State, the court held that the state constitution was not intended to eliminate government regulation of people's possession and use of firearms. Rather, the government retained, according to the court, the authority to enact and enforce laws prohibiting people from possessing firearms when there was a significant risk that they will use those firearms in a criminal or dangerous fashion. Shortly thereafter, the Court of Appeals upheld a law that prohibited felons from living in any house where they knew someone kept a concealed firearm. This decision was justified with a similar hand wave. In 2010, the Supreme Court of Alaska reiterated the hand-wavy analysis of the Court of Appeals, holding that the state constitutional right is limited and does not invalidate laws that restrict felon access to firearms. This, of course, being something that they were under no obligation to do, being that the state right is legally distinct from the federal one, and it is very obvious that what constitutes a felony has ballooned insanely in the preceding decades. In sum, while Alaska's constitution does appear to have an independent right to bear arms, the state judiciary does not appear interested in it beyond mere lip service. So now let's talk about restrictions on owning firearms. This is, if you ask me, the worst type of gun control. Prerequisites on owning a firearm at all. This section will be limited to run-of-the-mill pedestrian firearms like handguns, shotguns, and rifles. State restrictions on NATO guns that the feds like to regulate will be in the cool gun restrictions section later on in the video. To start with, there is no law in Alaska requiring gun owners to be licensed. Further, there is no state gun registration in Alaska, and Alaska law actually prevents any local government from passing a law resulting in the registration of firearms or knives. For the youngsters out there, Alaska prohibits anyone under the age of 16 from possessing a firearm without the consent of their guardian unless the minor is emancipated. That said, if you haven't already gotten one, Alaska forbids any person from knowingly selling a firearm to an individual under the age of 18. While federal law prohibits the possession of firearms by felons and domestic violence misdemeanants, Alaska has no such law regarding misdemeanants. Alaska does independently prohibit felons or people adjudicated delinquent minors for serious crimes from possessing concealable firearms. This prohibition does not apply if the felony was not an offense against the person and 10 years have passed from the person's unconditional discharge. Before 2010, Alaska law prevented anyone who was intoxicated by liquor or other drugs from possessing a handgun, but this law was repealed. Also, as we mentioned before, Alaska law prohibits people convicted of felonies from residing in a dwelling knowing that there is a concealed firearm in the dwelling. This prohibition can be avoided if the convicted person has written authorization to live there, either from a court of competent jurisdiction or the chief local law enforcement officer. Aside from the above, and federal law again aside, Alaska does not prohibit the purchase or possession of firearms by people convicted of misdemeanors, people subject to mental health orders, or people subject to restraining orders. Similarly to Alabama, the state of Alaska does a little more legwork than is federally required when it comes to mental health reporting. In 2014, the state passed HB 336, which required that upon issuance of an involuntary commitment order, that the information ultimately be supplied to the federal NICS database if held more than 72 hours. As far as Alaska's prohibitions do go, the state has no law requiring the removal of firearms from somebody who has become prohibited from possessing them. Now, this section is for laws that restrict how an individual can acquire or purchase a firearm. While, of course, federal law binds FFL dealers, Alaska does not require a background check or any specific paperwork when purchasing a firearm from a non-FFL. That said, Alaska prohibits any person from selling a firearm to an individual they know is under 18 or selling a handgun to a felon or drunk person. Alaska also has an interesting law governing pawnbrokers, which requires that they keep a permanent record of all sales. And for firearms, this includes the serial number and identity and signature of the purchaser. Aside from that, Alaska has no laws requiring the retention of sales or background check records within the state. Alaska also has no waiting periods, no laws regulating gun shows, and no laws regarding multiple sales or bulk purchases. Alright, self-making firearms. As we've discussed here many times, the right to keep and to bear something necessarily includes the right to acquire it, and the purest way to acquire something is surely to make it yourself. That's why it's definitely a point in Alaska's favor that it has no law restricting homemade, 3D printing, or otherwise lawfully unserialized firearms. That said, Alaska does penalize people who obliterate a serial number or possess a firearm with an obliterated serial number if the number was obliterated with the intent of rendering the gun untraceable. Again, not spotless, but so far pretty good compared to some of the other stuff we've seen. Alright, ammunition controls. Another obvious prerequisite to a real right to keep and bear arms is the ability to feed them. Just as a car without gas is more a fancy box than a vehicle, what is a gat without gatteries? Alaska has no laws requiring a license for the sale of ammunition, nor does it require sellers to keep records of ammunition purchasers, nor does it independently prohibit those prohibited from possessing firearms from possessing ammunition, nor does it prohibit armor-piercing ammunition. That said, in Alaska, a state parole board may require as a condition of release that the released prisoner not possess or control firearm ammunition. Not perfect, but definitely far from terrible here. Alright. Carry restrictions. Of course, to keep and bear includes bear. This might seem obvious to you as a rational person, but it is clearly something that a lot of states struggle with. Unlike Alabama, since 2003, Alaska does not require a permit to carry a concealed firearm. This 2003 law provides that anyone aged 21 or older who may lawfully possess a firearm may carry it concealed in Alaska without a permit. There were previously such permits issued, and they are still available for Alaskans who want to be able to carry in other states, or those who seek to be exempt from background checks for firearm purchases. If you are seeking a concealed permit in Alaska, it is a shall issue jurisdiction as long as you meet the following requirements. You must be 21 years of age or older. You must be eligible to own or possess a firearm under federal law. You must be an Alaska resident for the preceding 90 days. You must not have been convicted of 2 or more Class A misdemeanors in the preceding 6 years. You must not be in a substance abuse treatment program. And you must have completed a handgun training course. Concealed carry permits in Alaska expire on your birthday in the 5th year following issuance of the permit. The maximum period of time a single permit can be valid for is 5 years. Alaska law prohibits concealed carry permit information from being made public, although the records may be used for law enforcement purposes. As far as reciprocity goes, Alaska will honor permits from most states and has a fairly well-respected permit in less insane states. In fact, Alaska is required by law to enter into reciprocity agreements with states having such authority so that Alaskans can carry in those states. The above said, the fact that some random country sits between us and Alaska kind of messes up some of the utility of concealed carry reciprocity for car driving Alaskans. As far as open carry, Alaska does not prohibit the open carry of firearms in public. For a state where bears outnumber men, this is not terribly surprising. While Alaska has no law affecting carry on college or university property, Alaska does prohibit the knowing possession of a gun, no matter how carried, in any K-12 school, including the parking lot, without the permission of the chief district administrator. Also, although school ground possession is generally prohibited, people aged 21 or older may keep an unloaded firearm on school grounds provided it is carried in the trunk or in a closed container within the vehicle. Alaska law specifically provides that nobody can prevent a person from storing a firearm in a legally parked vehicle as long as the vehicle or firearm is locked. Employers in Alaska, however, may prohibit possession of firearms in employee vehicles in certain circumstances. That said, Alaska law does prohibit the possession of a firearm in the interior cabin of a vehicle when the possessor is impaired, again, by liquor or other intoxicating chemicals. In addition to the above, Alaska law prohibits the carrying of concealed handguns anywhere a person is prohibited from possessing a handgun under state or federal law, thus creating a separate state offense for federal possession crimes. Here's where it begins to get a bit weird, too. Alaska forbids anyone from knowingly carrying a concealed weapon into someone else's house without their permission. Alaska also prohibits carrying a loaded firearm anywhere liquor is sold for consumption on premises. It is, however, an affirmative defense to a prosecution of that law if the firearm was a handgun that was sufficiently concealed and the possession occurred at a restaurant where the defendant did not consume intoxicating liquors. Alaska also prohibits the carry of a firearm near to a child care center, in a courtroom, or a domestic violence shelter that receives state funding. As for parks, hospitals, churches, sports arenas, casinos, or polling places, state law is silent. Alright, self-defense regulations. Self-defense is an interesting thing to discuss in this context, as it's not exactly gun law, but a closely related and rapidly devolving area of law. While it was recognized for hundreds of years that the government could not possibly take an individual's right to defend against unlawful force away, activists and motivated jurists invented creative mechanisms to cock all this up. To combat this, like Alabama, Alaska adopted a statute clarifying that a person does not have a duty to retreat when their life is threatened, so long as the defending individual has a right to be wherever they were, otherwise known as a stand your ground law. Alright, cool gun restrictions. Here's where we'll talk about whether the state stacks stuff on top of the NFA and GCA when it comes to cool guns the feds don't like us having. Very disappointingly, Alaska law generally bans machine guns, SBRs, SBSs, and suppressors, defining them as a prohibited weapon. It is an affirmative defense to be charged under this section that the machine gun or other NFA item was possessed in compliance with federal law. Aside from that, there are no restrictions on magazine capacity, caliber, or assaultiness of firearms in Alaska. Okay, now, restoring your rights. We've talked quite a bit about losing rights, but getting them back is just as important, and a lot of people glance over stuff like this. Alaska is far from the worst here, with a heavy focus on rehabilitation that has been evidenced since it first achieved statehood. Alaska does prohibit felons or people adjudicated delinquent minors for serious crimes from possessing concealable firearms. This prohibition does not apply if the felony was not an offense against the person and 10 years have passed from the person's unconditional discharge. For people who committed felonies against a person, the right to arms is lost permanently unless the conviction is set aside or pardoned. The pardon power sits with the governor and is quite a few steps ahead of its exercise. For most other felonies, though, all civil rights are restored 10 years after the individual's unconditional release. Voting, office holding, and jury rights are restored immediately upon discharge. Okay, miscellaneous stuff. Now is where we cover the various and sundries before we get to a grade. State law in Alaska preempts local law, preventing many pesky local ordinances. Alaska also significantly limits nuisance lawsuits against gun manufacturers, gun ranges, stores, and other areas. Alaska has no Saturday night special laws, no law restricting toy guns, no requirement for specific firearm storage, no requirement that owners report lost or stolen guns, and no red flag law. Alright, let's assess and grade the icebox. Now that we've already got a state graded, I'm going to start grading future states relative to the previous ones. Compared to Alabama, which was rife with suspicious Reconstruction-era policies, Alaska seems to edge a bit better. That said, Alaska's wholesale prohibition of NFA firearms is infuriating and disappointing, with possession of federally registered guns not exempted, but merely an affirmative defense. That indicates to me that Alaska law views NFA firearms with extreme suspicion and distrust, something that is not a great stance for our rights, as there is no principal distinction between an NFA firearm and any other one. Still, though, the state treats gun owners, most of the time, with respect. Plus, state law, for the most part, recognizes the positive utility of a robust right to keep and bear arms. Automatic recovery of gun rights is also a big plus. It's not perfect, but a refreshing appeal to humanity, especially against the backdrop of an ever-expanding swath of nonviolent felonies. For these reasons, I'm awarding the state of Alaska the relatively high score of B, extremely close to B- for its repeated bizarre and unnecessary approval of some of the federal government's worst laws. On this much, I'm putting Alaska just above Alabama in terms of class rank. Think I'm wrong, or did I miss something? Let me know in the comments. I expect to make a follow-up in the future if things change for our friends in the icebox. Remember also to look at the date of this video's publication, as many things may be different if you're watching later on. Well, that's it for today, guys. Let me just say I really appreciate you guys watching and subscribing. It makes a huge difference. If you want to support me more than that, I started up a Patreon and a Subscribe Star. I've added benefits like, patron-only content, Discord, and there's surely more to come. This kind of support will help enable me to make more content more regularly, something I'd really love to be able to do. There's also a link to some new and improved Fuddbusters apparel, stickers, and of course the Magic ATF ball in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching to the end and for your support. I'll see you next time, or if you become a patron or Subscribe Star, I'll be happy to see you on the Discord. Remember, the anti-side has been working long and hard, passing laws and trying to push policies that make states rank poorly. Anything more than minimum compliance is self-regulation. Y'all take care.
Thank you.